corporate governance systems that recognize that companies are run not by saints or by sinners, but by fallible people who can be pushed one way or pushed the other. Right? It's not about bad apples and how we draw and quarter them, right? Because it's about what incentive structures exist for all of us ordinary mortals. And I will say this secondly, that today, in relationship to what I said earlier, right, the corporation that chooses to make reasonable contributions to their employees' retirement security, that ensures that none of its employees need to go to Medicaid for their health insurance, that corporation has to compete against people who are doing the opposite, right, in markets that are very, very, shall we say, that are without mercy. Right? And so in a larger sense, which goes beyond corporate governance and goes to the larger ways in which our society addresses who's going to provide the fundamental components of a middle-class lifestyle to the majority of Americans. Right now, we have perverse systems working in those areas. Right? And frankly, if you're driving the perversity of those systems, no amount of good PR will in the end cover up the fact that that's what you're driving, that you're destroying the foundations of America as a relatively egalitarian middle-class society, or you're contributing to them.
Well, one of the areas in which a segment of the public does sense have a PR problem with major corporations or some major corporations is the area of whether or not boards of directors exercise proper oversight and control over companies, or whether or not they simply fall asleep at the switch, or in the case of Conrad Black's entities, the jury's, I think, still out on Mr. Black, but apparently he had a captive board of directors. And then, of course, related to that board of directors problem is the public perception that executive compensation has gotten completely out of hand and kilter, and that a lot of people are either self-dealing or perceived to be acting in their own short-term interests rather than the long-term interests of the firm. Does anyone want to raise or bring up the issue of the board of directors or the executive compensation?
Well, I just want to go back to say that if you don't have the right CEO in terms of driving performance with integrity in the company, the board can't solve that problem. They meet 8 times a year, they meet 10 times a year, they meet for 3 hours, they meet for 6 hours. They don't know what's going on in Thailand, Japan, China, Romania. You have to have the CEO who's got the right values, who can both manage the complexity and also provide the leadership on values.
Do boards ask enough questions?
Beg your pardon?
Do boards ask enough questions?
Well, again, they have a very important oversight role. I mean, I don't think we have any doubt about that, and I think there's been a change from the 90s to this decade where they're much more aware of things. But all I'm trying to say is they can't do the job. They can oversee and check. I think most people in this area would agree that we should have pay for performance. I think the difficulty is that not enough companies have really sort of tried to articulate exactly what that means. And I would add to it pay for performance, not just in terms of financial performance, but on these other sets of issues that I've talked about today. So I think the challenge that still exists, although it's ironic that the people in private equity and hedge funds can make vast sums without any kind of supervision, the market's working, CEOs don't do quite that well. But I think we clearly have a crisis where people have to understand what they did for what they got. And I think in many respects, notwithstanding a whole series of new SEC disclosure rules, which have maybe made it more complicated, not less, I don't think the American people understand that clearly, and that's that is definitely a board responsibility, not a management responsibility.
You know, John, here's one where I think a lot of parties bear some responsibility. Right? The board of directors, as Ben says, the board of directors has relatively limited information and certainly relatively limited time, and that's not going to change. The problem, though, with executive comp is, so we all agree it should be performance. How do we measure performance? If we measure performance by stock price movements alone, which Ben is, I believe, arguing we should not, that we should have multiple performance metrics. Right? And I'm with Ben 100%. I think that a major reason for the sort of explosion in executive comp is weak boards, shareholders who demand a single metric, which is short-term stock price movements, and executives who look at that situation and say, as long as I ask for stock or stock-related instruments, the shareholders will be fine, right? And I've got a weak board, I can ask for anything and I'll get it. as long as the comp consultant authorizes it, and I've got 10 different ways of making sure the comp consultant's in my pocket. That arrangement, right, which is not improved when shareholders demand pay for performance, pay for performance, without getting into what the performance you want to be paid for is. That arrangement produces what we've got today. And the solution is shareholders who say two things. One is, we want multidimensional performance. We want boards who will be tough and speak for us and not for them, not for the people they're negotiating against, but who will ultimately speak for the corporation, the institution, and who will look for measures of performance that are multidimensional, right? That really capture, I think, what several of the panelists here have said about the sort of real nature of the identity and purpose and function of a healthy and functional business. The challenge, though, right? The challenge, though, when that happens, is at the same time to be able to say to the CEO, there is such a thing as too much, right? There's such a thing as too much for everyone else who works for the corporation. No one else gets to walk in and say, I did a good job today, I'd like infinite pay, right? There is such a thing as too much. If you have those three things in mind, board independence, multiple factors, and a consciousness on the part of the board and the people who work for them as professional advisors, that there is such a thing as too much, we'll get someplace. I don't know whether we're going to get there or not, though.
Well, that's a